Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I want to talk about China for a little bit. On yesterday's program, I talked about a group, a Philharmonic orchestra that was going to travel from Rochester, I think it was Rochester, to Beijing to perform, and China refused to issue visas to some members of the orchestra because they were South Koreans. Now, it wasn't clear to me yesterday whether they were South Korean citizens or they were South Koreans who had become American citizens, and I don't think it really makes any difference. They were South Koreans, and because they were of South Korean descent or, naturalized U.S. citizens from South Korea, it didn't make any. It made no difference to China. They were going to refuse the visas, and of course the orchestra capitulated, and they went without those orchestra members. I get it; it's their choice, but I'm becoming more and more concerned about our capitulation to anything that China demands, and I think part of the reason for that is as the slow death of U.S. dominance continues, I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves. The dominance of America as a superpower is slowly but steadily losing ground, and it's losing ground primarily to China. And I find that almost to be this paradox, this contradiction, because while we are losing our dominance, China itself is faltering at the same time that it's gaining dominance in world affairs. One of the ways they do this is China has overseas investments that span the globe. The Chinese Navy patrols major sea lanes while the country colonizes the South China Sea in slow motion. You've heard me talking about the building of the islands in the South China Sea. You've heard me talk about how China is building up its military and in essence, taking over the South China Sea, controlling that entire area between Australia and the Philippines and Southeast Asia, taking complete control of that, and we don't seem to be doing anything. And the Chinese government continues to crack down on dissent at home while administering a hefty dose of nationalist propaganda. All we have to do is look at Hong Kong and see that there is a slow but steady crackdown on those in Hong Kong who are simply doing this. I think we lose in all of the news about the Hong Kong protests. They're not really asking for independence. They're simply protesting the loss of the autonomy that Hong Kong was guaranteed when the Brits turned it over to mainland China. One of those is a new law that says that for essentially any reason or no reason, for any crime or no crime, people in Hong Kong can be almost like a rendition, removed to China for a trial or no trial, or just to be disappeared or to put in one of the concentration camps. That's really all they're asking for. They're not really, I'm sure there are some within the Hong Kong movement that want independence back. But the genesis of the protest was simply, no, you are reneging on the original deal that said in exchange for the Brits giving up Hong Kong, that China would allow them to remain autonomous and would allow self-governance and self-ruling within the province. Well, that's kind of going by the wayside. And now Beijing's newfound assertiveness looks, at least at first glance, and this is what I mean by being a paradox. When you look at how Beijing is asserting itself around the world, it looks like a growing power with growing ambition. But if you listen to Gordon Chang, and if you listen to who's of the Daily Beast, and you listen to other Chinese experts, it's nothing of the sort. China's actions actually reflect a profound unease among its leaders. because they're now facing the first sustained economic slowdown in a generation, and they don't see any end in sight to this slow descent of their economic power. Their economic conditions have steadily worsened since the 2008 financial crisis. The country's growth rate has fallen by half, is likely to plunge further in the years ahead because of their debt, foreign protectionism, resource depletion, and, like the rest of the world, an aging population that's taking a toll on their economy. Their economic woes will actually make China less competitive as a rival in the long term, but a greater threat to the United States today. And here's why. When rising powers have suffered such slowdowns in the past, they become more repressive at home and more aggressive abroad. And China seems to be going down that traditional path. So let's go back to March of 2007. At the height of a year-long economic boom, then Premier Wen Jiabao gave this uncharacteristically gloomy press conference. China's growth model, he warned, had become, quote, unsteady, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. Well, his warning back in 2007 was really forward-thinking. In the years since, China's official gross domestic product growth rate has dropped from 15%. Can you imagine an economic growth rate in this country of 15%? I'm happy with 8%, 7%. I'd be ecstatic about 10%, and I'd be orgasmic about 15%. Well, China's has dropped in that period from 2007 to today from 15% to 6%. That is the slowest growth rate in China in more than 30 years. So their economy is now experiencing its longest deceleration since the Mao era. And I think what's funny about it, when you talk about China's growth rate, their GDP descending from 15% to 6%, I know many of us are thinking, wow, that's still spectacular. But by way of contrast, consider that the United States economy has been stuck at a rate of around 2%. And a lot of economists believe that China's true rate is roughly half the official figure. And their growth does not necessarily translate into greater wealth. If a country spends, and I want you to think about this, because there's a parallel here between China and the United States, a parallel path, but on two different tracks. Here's what I mean. In China, they spend billions of dollars on infrastructure projects, and the GDP rises. Here we spend trillions of dollars on social safety programs, on social programs, and our GDP is stuck. But if those projects in China, including a bridge to nowhere like we did, the country's stock of wealth will actually be unchanged or perhaps even decline. Because you see, to accumulate wealth, a country needs to increase its productivity. And productivity in China over the last decade has actually been dropping. Almost all of China's GDP growth has resulted from the government's pumping of capital into the economy. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that's quantitative easing. That's what we've been doing. When you subtract government stimulus spending, some economists say that China's economy may actually not be growing at all. The signs of unproductive growth, at least in China, I think are easy to spot. They built more than 50 ghost cities. What's a ghost city? Can you imagine in the United States if we took 1,000 square miles somewhere in the middle of New Mexico, Wyoming, I don't care, on the eastern plains of Colorado, and the government started building empty offices, empty apartments, malls, airports, and nobody occupied it. That's what China's doing. And they have built 50 of these cities. Nationwide, more than 20% of homes in China are vacant. Excess capacity in major industries is over 30%. Factories are sitting idle. Goods are rotting in warehouses. Total losses from all that waste is difficult to calculate, but China's government estimates that it blew at least $6 trillion on ineffective investment between 09 and 014. 09 and 14, not 014. So China's debt has quadrupled in absolute size over the last 10 years and currently exceeds 300% of its GDP. Now, there has never been a nation that has ever racked up so much debt so fast in peacetime. We look at our ratio of debt, whether it be liabilities or unfunded liabilities, and while we may be close to 100% of GDP, we're nowhere near 300% of GDP. And we're still, the assets that were propelling China's growth are fast turning into liabilities. For example, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the Chinese enjoyed expanding access to foreign markets and technology. China was nearly self-sufficient in food, water, and energy. It had the greatest demographic divide in history, with 8 working-age adults for every citizen over the age of 65. Now, China is losing access to foreign markets. They're losing access to technology. And let's point out, let's be honest, part of that is their own fault. Why does Apple consider moving some of its production to Vietnam or other places? Why do many countries now, maybe I don't want to do my manufacturing in China? Because they steal the intellectual property all the time. They are suffering from their own communist corruption, and it's beginning to show in the economic numbers. Remember the one-child policy? China's about to experience the worst aging crisis in history because it's going to lose 200 million workers and young consumers, and it's going to add 300 million seniors in the course of 30 years. Any country that has accumulated debt, lost productivity, or aged at anything close to what China's current ratio or rate is, has lost at least one decade to near zero economic growth. So what would China do? This is why I think China is the existential threat. No, don't get me wrong. I do believe that the Democrats and all the socialist policies, if not the outright Marxist policy of the Democrats, if they were to win the presidency, keep the House, and regain control of the Senate, they would be an existential threat to the country. And then we would face the simultaneous existential threat of Marxist policies taking over this country at the same time that China's plummeting economically, demographically, in every way possible. And what happens? What happens when you've created all these expectations among your population of growth? You're building all these fancy highways, you're building all of these cities, you're building, and you're opening these markets, and Chinese citizens are able to go to the equivalent of Fifth Avenue, or are able to shop and buy all of the great things, that material goods that we're able to buy. And then suddenly they start to realize, no, we're actually facing stagnation. We're not gaining any wealth. Chinese individuals are not getting wealthier. They will begin to stagnate also. So in a communist country, fearful of unrest, communist leaders then start cracking down on domestic dissent. And that's exactly what we see going on with these social media, social scores that they're giving out, with what they're doing in Hong Kong, with what they're doing with the Uyghurs, with the concentration camps of anybody that dissents in any way. They are cracking down on dissent. They are cracking down as hard as they possibly can. The Chinese Communist Party entered into its most recent plenary session just in the past 24 hours or so. And I don't know that we'll get much news about what they're doing, but my guess is they'll come out even more stringent, even more harder, cracking down even further on Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, and dissent within the country. And the precedent for doing that is amazing if you understand history. If you look at the past 150 years, nearly a dozen great powers went through rapid economic growth followed by long slowdowns. And nobody accepted that new normal quietly. Give you an example. U.S. growth plummeted in the late 19th century. And what did Washington do? They suppressed the labor strikes with violence while pumping investment and exports into Latin America and East Asia, annexing territory there, building a gigantic navy to protect our far-flung assets. Russia, same thing, late 19th century slowdown. The Tsar responded by consolidating his authority, building the Trans-Siberian Railway, occupying parts of Korea, Manchuria, Japan, and Germany. They all suffered economic crisis during the interwar years. All these countries turned to authoritarianism. And then they went on rampages to seize resources and smash foreign rivals. France even had a post-war boom that fizzled in the 1970s. And what did the French government do? They tried to reconstitute its economic sphere of influence in Africa. They sent 14,000 troops to its former colonies and embarked on a dozen military interventions there over the next 2 years. Over the next 20 years. What am I thinking? 20 years. And then I want you to think about 2009 and the collapse of oil prices. That led Russia, who was going through just what China's going through, to pressure its neighbors to join a regional trade bloc, and then just a few years later, that campaign morphed into a campaign of coercion that started Ukraine's revolution and Russia's annexation of Crimea. So we have a historical precedent that shows that when these stagnating countries, particularly, I want to say particularly authoritarian regimes, but I only say that because authoritarian regimes don't have the will of the people like we do to, maybe we're late to the game, but at least under our Republican form of government, we can see what they're doing, and if we see what the leaders are doing and we don't like it, we can throw them out of office. In authoritarian regimes, the only way to do that is through assassination and revolutions. And that rarely happens. And when it does, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to democratize or you're going to bring about individual freedom and liberty in those previous authoritarian regimes. So what's going to happen in a country like China? Because the Chinese government owns a lot of the country's major companies, and those firms substantially influence the state. It is, we talk about crony capitalism. Well, this is crony communism, where the government owns a lot of the companies. Those companies influence the Communist Party and vice versa. So for that reason, what will the government do? They're going to go to great lengths to protect those companies from foreign competition. They're going to help those companies conquer overseas markets when the profits begin to dry up domestically. And now you've got a state-led economy like China that is not going to liberalize during a slowdown. Because if they were to do that, that would require eliminating subsidies and protections for these state-favored firms. So reforms that risk instigating a surge in unemployment or popular resentment, that's not going to happen. Liberalization is not going to happen when the economy suffers in a communist country. And actually what they're going to do is they're going to become more aggressive. They're going to become more aggressive in their crackdown. They're going to become more protective or more expansive in their protectionism. They're going to become much more aggressive in all of the aspects of communism that you and I abhor. Their behavior, if we watch what's going on right now, is a textbook response to economic insecurity. President Xi Jinping has given a lot of speeches warning party members of the potential for a Soviet-style collapse. They're actually worried about that. They watch their history. They understand their history, which is why the crackdown, in my opinion, and the antagonism toward the United States will become even more advanced and even more intense. The government has already doubled internal security spending over the past decade. They have the most advanced propaganda, censorship, and surveillance system in the history of the world. China has detained, you've heard me talk about the Uyghurs. 1 million Uyghurs are now in concentration camps. And President Xi has actually concentrated power in his hands as dictator for life. These are not the actions of a confident superpower. These are the actions of a panicked superpower. It doesn't mean, I saw something on Twitter talking about China and what would I think it was on Quora. You ever looked at the website Quora? Is what would an attack by China on the United States look like? And whoever gave the answer was a military expert, gave an answer about how unlikely that is. But it doesn't mean that we can't go to war with China in other ways. War economically, war socially, trade wars, the kinds of things where it's we have proxy wars, just like we have proxy wars in the Middle East right now, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and Turkey, everywhere. We got all these proxy wars going on. It doesn't mean we couldn't have similar proxy wars with Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan. We can enter into all sorts of proxy wars. I think the danger to the United States is clear. Espionage, protectionism, a splintered internet. I mean, what's Google doing? They're creating an internet, or at least they claim they've stopped doing it, but I still believe they are. A splintered internet that one for the Chinese, one for the rest of the world, Navy clashes in the East and the South China Sea, a war over Taiwan. I mean, all of these things are realistic. Do I think they're going to happen today? No. But I think what we need to understand as just ordinary American citizens is that on a global scale, China is a threat. And so when Trump starts taking these actions against China, it really is a game of chicken, because we know what they've been doing to us over the past many decades has got to stop. So he has put his foot down. But he has also put his foot down at a time when China is looking at, okay, if you want to have this battle, we'll have this battle, because at home they're suffering economically. What will they do? I don't know. But what D.C. has to do, what the president has to do, is to deter Chinese aggression, somehow let China know that we understand that you have insecurities and that you have problems domestically, and that somehow insulate us from blowback should any deterrence or reassurance fail. There's just inherent tensions between the United States and China that go way beyond trade. And I think that's because, and I don't blame Americans for this, because the media doesn't cover it. The media doesn't explain it. Nobody really understands what's going on in China. You know, on my radio program, I try to talk about the concentration camps. I try to talk about the social media crackdown, the social scoring system. I tried to explain just how horrible life is in China. And then if you understand the economic problems that they're having, and that doesn't mean that they're weak. I mean, what happens? You wound an animal. Every hunter knows this. You wound an animal, that animal becomes more dangerous the weaker it becomes. That's why you want a clean kill when you're hunting. China's kind of that wounded animal right now. And where or if they lash out, nobody knows. I just want all of us to be aware that a weakened China is not necessarily good for us. Because the problem is, as well as we're doing economically right now, we're in debt up to our eyeballs. We could easily slide into some sort of economic depression, a recession, a slowdown of any sort that would make us weak like China. That could happen worldwide. Everybody is just immersed in all of this debt. And at some point, somewhere down the road, some tipping point causes all of that debt for people to start saying, yeah, I want my cash. And nobody's going to have the cash. And China right now is on the front end of that. Thanks for listening. I know this is kind of an unusual topic, but I've talked about China. I listen. If you're not aware of Gordon Chang, who writes for the Daily Beast, he truly is one of the best Chinese experts in the media. And if you have an opportunity, you ought to look him up and put him in your bookmarks and read what Gordon Chang talks about or writes about regarding China. It's a great insight that you won't get anywhere else. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.